Brussels office and our partners from the EU institutions, the think tank world, foundations, and scholars, we are engaging in policy debates and offer recommendations on the following themes: global Europe and the transatlantic relationship, European neighborhood and enlargement policies, the future of democracy, and European economy. If interested to read more about our work, I encourage you to check our key publications, including Making Flexible Europe Work, European Governance and Potential for Differentiated Cooperation, Europe's Migration Myths, GlobeSec Guide to Debunk Myths about the European Union, and Revisited Scenarios for Europe, Central and Eastern European Perspectives.
Hello, everyone. My name is Stephen Erlanger. I'm the European diplomatic correspondent of the New York Times, and I want to welcome you all here. I want to compliment you also, because it's deep in a Friday afternoon in August, and we have a very good panel for you, and I hope you will participate. The topic, as you can see, is a really crucial one, which is, are we moving toward a more fragmented European Union? And how really has the virus and other challenges affected Brussels? So let me introduce my panel, our panel. First, we have Michal Semetska, who is a member of the European Parliament in Brussels, currently home in Bratislava. He's a member of the Committee on Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs. We have Stefan Lenn, who is a wonderful person, former Austrian diplomat with Carnegie now, visiting scholar with Carnegie Europe. We have Kinga Brudzinska, a Pole who's director of the Future of Europe program at GlobeSec. And now visible, we have Heather Graby, who is head of the Open Society European Policy Institute in Brussels. It's a great panel. So I'm going to start by asking a couple questions and let our panelists jump in as they like. It strikes me as we talk about COVID and the potential to change the European Union, you could look at it from two sides. One, in a possibly optimistic way, you look at the Recovery Fund and the 7-year multi-annual budget, and you say, see, the Germans have given in, and there's a kind of collective debt, and this sets a model for the future. Maybe, or maybe it's a one-off and it'll never happen again. But there is a gesture of solidarity. But on the other side, perhaps you look at what's happening to Schengen. If you live in Belgium, you can't go to Paris. There's quarantines everywhere. The idea of open borders has been breaking down, and some wonder whether it will ever come back again. So, Michal, let's start with you. Which is it? Is the glass fuller or is it emptier on European development and cohesion?
Thanks, Stephen, and it's great to be here, and thanks for everyone. Thanks to everyone for watching. Well, I would tend to see the glass as half full, to be honest, and especially if compared to the previous crises that the EU has dealt with, and has, I think, dealt with much more difficulty and much more disunity and much slower, speaking of the migration crisis, say, or the financial crisis, compared to this one. And also, I think I would see the glass half full compared to what we imagined could have happened back in back in March, I remember here in Slovakia, lots of people and journalists asking, well, is the European Union going to break up? Because at the time there were real fears that given how we were unable to help Italy, and how there were all these discussions of how crucial materials being held at borders and stuff. I mean, at the time, lots of people wondered whether the EU will survive this crisis at all, whether we would see the end of Schengen, whether we would be deadlocked on the North versus South debate on Corona bonds forever, and all that. So I think against that benchmark, I think the EU. And the big story is that the resilience of the EU, especially obviously, I mean, pointing to the recovery package. But even so, if you compare the response and the performance to the US or the UK, even, I think the EU is doing much better than we could have expected. So that's the sort of how full. Whether the recovery package is going to be one-off or it's going to be here to stay. I mean, obviously the size of it is going to be a one-off. That was the trade-off. That's why actually the Frugals accepted it. But there are elements of it which might be transformative, which might stay. The most important one being that given that when we start borrowing money on the financial markets as the European Union, I mean, we also create a market for these EU bonds, and that tends to have a staying power. And the second will be the debate about own resources. Once we actually develop EU's own resources to pay for this debt, that might stay on, and the EU might have resources of its own, and that will outlive the recovery package.
I think that's going to be a big fight, but not one for this minute. Own resources is going to be another big north-south, east-west issue. Kinga, I wondered what you thought. You come from a country that sometimes can be skeptical about what Brussels wants. Do you see COVID bringing Europe to a new, better place, or somehow showing its weaknesses or fissures?
Thank you very much, and good afternoon also to everyone. As Stephen said, it's Friday afternoon on August. You can partly blame me. I was the one who was participating in designing this trend of more fragmentation of the EU, and I was just thinking that maybe if we would choose a title, More Powerful EU, maybe we would get to the first day of this conference. So this I will have it in mind in shaping European topics in the future. But it also, I think, shows a little bit the position of the EU and the state of play and decades of the multiple crises that EU has been gone through. You, Stephen, you were very diplomatic in saying about Poland and its Euroscepticism sometimes. But I would say when I was preparing for this panel, I read some polls and I was trying to learn what are the feelings of the people. And actually, from the recent poll in June from the European Parliament, there were two words that feelings that the Europeans feel associate with, which is the hope and uncertainty. And I think this is also how reflects the State of the Union today. We hope that this rescue package will help us to go through the crisis and wish for more solidarity. But then also, we are not sure about the future of European project. The COVID-19 showed us that nothing about the EU is irreversible and inevitable, and also about the given country participation in the European project. To my view, it's possible that in the long term, the EU, as it is now, the current architecture, will become a more loose intergovernmental project, but there will be a core and there will be member states that they will build political union that will be able and willing to delegate more power to Brussels. Where there are multiple reasons for that. I will maybe give one example. everyone is talking about the budget. And for example, now the Commission said that in Poland, certain cities or municipalities that do not treat equally or minorities will not receive the funds. What happened is that the Polish government said that if the EU does not give money, we will just triple that amount and a given city or municipality will receive it. So my biggest fear is that regardless of punishments or measures coming from Brussels, there might be governments saying that, and what's the problem? We don't care if we can hope the EU. So a little bit of pessimistic scenario, but this is how I feel this summer about the EU.
Very good, thank you. No, because I mean, this is one of the great debates that is always going on. I mean, which is, where's Europe going and where's it heading and will it die and will it, you know, I don't think it will die. I'm a big optimist, but it can't stay the same. And so this is one of these questions. Heather, I'm going to come to you now that you're hooked up before you disappear again. Whether you think this is a moment where the EU finds a new impetus and rationale, or something else?
Sure. Well, this is always the question after every crisis. And every crisis that the EU faces becomes an existential one, because the expectations for the EU being able to coordinate a response are always so much higher than its capacity to do so. Because the EU was not set up, it wasn't designed as a rapid response mechanism. It's a slow-moving, often lowest common denominator club of sovereign countries which are quite keen to do things in an intergovernmental way, as Kinga was just pointing out. And it simply doesn't respond with decisive executive action, because its member states have never wanted it to be able to take decisive executive action above their heads. They want all of the member states to be involved, and they want to ensure that every government has a say in the critical moments of response. So I think it's done pretty well in the circumstances, but it's never going to be stellar, and it always leads to disappointment. But what the EU is very good at is setting up enduring policy frameworks which establish rules of the game and establish mechanisms for cooperation, which often do manage to survive the crisis. And so I think the new impetus that you were just asking about, Steve, will be in the domain of ensuring that countries both have more access to resources at EU level, and so the arguments about resources, about the budget and about new conditionalities as well as new funds that are available will go hand in hand with also more interest in the governance of member states and more concern for the EU level to have oversight of those, because this crisis has been a very different one from the one that started in 2008, which was started as a banking and financial crisis and then became an economic crisis, but which revealed problems with risk in the financial sector in various member states that clearly was not being accounted for at EU level. This time we've seen risks in health systems, but also in many other systems where there wasn't actually all that much coordination and cooperation between member states. So I think what will happen is the EU's increasing role in the governance at national level of key policies like health, but also economic policies and increasingly rule of law. These are the areas which will endure after this crisis. But I don't think we can expect to see a fantastic rapid response mechanism that will allow the EU to respond faster to future pandemics than it has responded to this one.
Right, good, thank you. I mean, and obviously health was not an EU competence, which was part of the problem and part of the fumbling. And maybe it will be soon. I mean, it seems like a good thing for the EU, let's say, to be working on finding a vaccine, paying for vaccines for everybody, right? That kind of thing seems very useful. Stefan, I want to turn to you. You have been watching the EU for a really, really long time. You've been up and down with it. You have your own, sometimes optimistic, sometimes skeptical view, but I think of you as a great realist. So what does realism tell you today about what the virus does to the EU?
Thank you, and good afternoon to everyone. Well, I consider the Recovery Fund as a huge achievement, a great sign of hope, but I still see the dynamic of fragmentation and the risk of fragmentation that is quite serious. And I give you basically two reasons for that. The first one is that essentially the EU was an engine of economic liberalism, taking away obstacles to trade, to exchanges, etc. This was the agenda, this was the consensus basically, and this was very much in line with the dynamic of globalization. And even before the COVID crisis, somehow the climate in Europe changed, the kind of much more negative attitude to globalization, and the crisis has triggered sort of the return of a strong national state. Initially, more or less, the internal market disappeared, Schengen disappeared, the nation state was back in full force. And to some extent, this is still the case. You've pointed to Schengen, to the fact that even now, 6 months after the beginning of the crisis, the decisions on opening borders and closing borders, on allowing tourists to come and go, are still national decisions. And the Commission is trying desperately to do some kind of coordinating role, but it's failing ultimately. It has not taken back the initiative. So I see the sort of political economic model of Europe changing, and it will be ideally, of course, the EU becomes the engines of a new political economic model, maybe with more social rights, more equality, stronger taxation system, etc. But I doubt very much whether there is the consensus in the EU to find a common way forward, a departure from the long-established model of economic liberalization. So that would lead to friction between the member states and between and the EU institutions and among the member states itself, because some are still keen on the liberalization agenda, others are departing from it. So this is the first reason. And the second reason is I simply doubt that the Recovery Fund, wonderful as it is, will be really effective to have an impact on macroeconomics. If you look at the expectation for growth in Germany is -6%. The expectation for growth in Italy is -11 to 12%. And the Recovery Fund, in terms of its impact on the national economies in the South, is maybe between 2 and 3% to the maximum. So I think the divergence between the North and the South will increase as a result of the crisis. And that, of course, is a very bad thing in terms of the sustainability of monetary union. So I think while the Recovery Fund is a very positive development, there are reasons to be worried about the future.
Thank you. You've, as often, you've put your finger on a couple of issues that interest me a lot, that I would like more people to engage with. One is, you know, the disease brings back the nation state, and it brings it back in a Europe that already was having issues of coherence, where there was resentment over Brussels rules and so on. It's not just Poland, it's all the Visegrad countries too, and that's one issue. And the other issue, which I think is really important, and is this question of whether the disease will, as you say, exacerbate the economic differences inside not just the Eurozone, but inside Europe too. Because the Recovery Fund, for all its wonders, will come very late. And frankly, countries like Italy and Spain are benefited much more from the ECB right now, which we haven't really talked about. I mean, this extraordinary willingness of the ECB to just cover the spreads to make sure that people can borrow money now when they actually need it. So I'm going to open this to anyone who wants to talk about these two issues, or one at a time. One about the rise of the nation, you know, in the face of everything, and the other, whether in fact there'll be more economic disparity following this, where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Maybe that's too dark a view. Who'd like to respond to that? Raise your hand.
Yeah.
Michal?
Yeah.
Go ahead. And then Heather?
Yes,
then
I mean,
okay.
on the economic divergence, I mean, of course it's going to take place because, I mean, after all, the recovery fund and including with the MFF, I mean, it's such a small, it's just a fraction of the EU's overall GDP. I mean, it's less than 2%. And it was always clear that there would have to be sort of national responses and national capacity that would have to, you know, bear the brunt of the fiscal response. Anyway, it's just, you know, the money is too small and would always be too small. But it's different than for some countries. For example, for my country, you know, the kind of money that we're getting in grants and loans, it's basically, and even just if you take the resilience and recovery facility, it's just it's another budget. It's tantamount to another annual budget. So it's especially for smaller countries, it's a lot of money. But of course, this is never going to be enough to eliminate the divergence that we'll see, simply because some member states have greater fiscal capacity. I mean, Germany, of course, and the Netherlands, and some don't because of past debts, because of all the structural problems. But there are also other instruments which we, you know, should point out, apart from the budget and the Next Generation EU, which countries can tap into. I mean, there's obviously the European Stability Mechanism, which is difficult for political reasons, but there's also, of course, the ECB. So I think there would have been divergence anyway, but the conditions in the EU, the budget, the Next Generation EU, the other instruments, and the ECB policies make it, I think, the best possible moment for even countries which are in a more difficult situation to borrow money. But of course, I mean, the fact is that the rescue package will not going to be enough. The other thing, and this is about the issue of the rising nation state, you're absolutely right. I think that when in a crisis situation, even all citizens look to the governments to solve it, and the governments, by shutting borders, by instituting the various restrictions, obviously took center stage. But I think you could still see that it was interesting that in some respects the EU and the Commission in particular was able to assert itself even in March and April, and particularly where it was its competence. For instance, in the internal market, there was this big issue of Germany basically refusing to export health equipment that was needed to other EU member states. But the Commission stepped in because it's the internal market, and it was able to bring Germany to freely circulate that critical equipment. So you can also see that the Commission, where it has competence, can assert itself. So yeah, I mean, going forward, you would see even in the recovery fund, the fact that it's attached to the budget, the fact that the Commission is in charge of it still. I think it's very different than in the financial and economic crisis a couple of years back, when it was a intergovernmental deal by the member states and the EU institutions were completely shut out.
Great. Heather?
Yeah, to complement that, I think there's something of a paradox here. So this pandemic has revealed to all citizens globally the downsides of interdependence, the downsides of people traveling so much, of economies being interdependent, of there being so much trade and movement, because that's why the pandemic, the disease was able to spread so rapidly, and why it was very hard to contain either the health effects or indeed the economic effects in one country or another. But the paradox lies in the fact that has caused people to look to their government, as Michal just said, and so that there's a kind of retreat to the nation state. But at the same time, governments have to coordinate and cooperate among themselves a lot more, because otherwise they can't get the information, they can't keep the measures in place. I mean, there's a huge amount of information flow between governments in order to do track and trace, and in order to find out how people are moving and to coordinate measures as well. And I think there'll be more of that as the economic impact hits. But the paradox lies in the fact that there's more big government, there's a much bigger role for the state in a crisis, a health crisis like this, but not necessarily big governance. We're not moving at all towards a one world government, as some of the conspiracies say, quite the opposite. Because look at how difficult it's been for the World Health Organization and for the UN to play a bigger coordinating role, partly because of lack of US support under this administration, but also because there's a fragmentation among their membership too. Whereas the EU, as something of a meso level of governance, a regional organization which has a strong community of law, is able to do a lot more in terms of coordinating responses because of the community of law, which means that agreements stick, and because there's a greater commitment to working together among the member governments. So if you think about it in that macro picture, rather than with our expectations that the EU can do everything, the EU's has still got actually a really important role to play. But I think the key question about the sustainability of an EU response on this, and this issue about the economic disparities, lies in how the different countries change towards a different kind of economic model. Stefan Lehner was rightly pointing out the way that this crisis is rapidly speeding up the turn away from economic liberalism, bringing the state back in, bringing big government back in. But governments in the EU have very different capabilities to do that. So in the immediate term, we've seen this in terms of state aids, where I think member states have now spent something like 3 trillion euros on state aids, an absolutely extraordinary amount. And half of those have been spent in Germany. So German companies are much more supported by their government than those in Italy, for example, or in Spain, even in comparison in France, and definitely in the smaller member states. So there's already a big disparity in how much big companies in particular can look to the state to prop them up in this kind of crisis. And there's also huge differences in how far governments are able to do redistribution and social security, so social support of different kinds to in terms of furlough schemes and unemployment assistance and so on. And yeah, there's been some money put to that through the Recovery Fund, but the capacity of across the EU to support their populations and help them in a crisis like this varies enormously. It's so much bigger in the north of Europe than it is in the south. So it's not just economic disparities in terms of GDP growth, it's also how much the population and small businesses and also the Mittelstand feel they can be supported by their government. And that's where some countries can move away from economic liberalism towards state support much more rapidly than others. And the Recovery Fund won't affect that very much. So I think we'll see the Nordics and Germany being able to do it to a much greater extent.
Great. I just want to give Kinga a chance to respond to.
Yeah, I agree with Heather and Michał, and also what I would just add is also speed of the decision that were made to compare with the last crisis. The decision or forging a consensus on the recovery package actually was very fast. So of course money will come later, but today we are much further away than when we were in 2009 or 10. What was also interesting about the member states, of course, I think it's a very human to turn to your country when you face a pandemic and you don't know what to do, whether to use a mask or not. WHO says you shouldn't wear masks, but yet in Slovakia, everyone has started to use masks at the very beginning. So I think it's really, it's just what we do. We were scared and we turned to member states, but without coordination on the EU level, I think everyone knows that this cannot be coordinated and it can be not solved or fought on the EU level. So I want to say that EU has learned from the past experience and draw lessons learned and applied in this crisis. I really like the quote of Jean Monnet. It's from 1979. line, and he said that actually the EU, it's fortune crisis, and it will be some of the responses solutions applied for crises. So how the EU will come up of it will be the fate of the whole organization. But before the crisis, actually, before the pandemic, we started it in February. We conducted an opinion poll. It was a qualitative one on the willingness of delegate more power. We had a conversation with Heather about it on this multi-speed concept of Europe or flexible cooperation. And what is interesting, it's obvious that member states are not willing at this stage to delegate more power, but there are certain groups that emerged and from it, and Heather started to classify them, and I would add two additional groups. So first, we have governments in the EU that are all in. They sign up. Let's see, on a Franco-German motor, but also Portugal, Belgium, and also Estonia. They are willing to cooperate in a bigger, but also in the smaller formats of cooperation. There are also those that don't want. There are those that have opt-outs, like Denmark, Sweden, Ireland, but also Poland or Hungary, that they don't want to go to the Eurozone, even though they are not opposed to the European integration itself. We also have those that cannot get in, which are Bulgaria and Romania. But also we want those, especially small countries, that want to sit on the main table in the EU, but kind of are not invited to the VIP parties. And so this is the model that EU is in. I don't think this pandemic will change this model. It will muddle through, as many say, sure. But let's hope though there's also those smaller circles that have been created will not disrupt or dismantle the EU in short or long term.
Okay. Very, very good. I have one more issue. I mean, there are lots of issues. I mean, one of the problems with the budget is it cuts military spending to almost ludicrous levels. So that says something about ambitions for strategic autonomy. But there's also a big promise that the new money would be used for green development, right? That everyone talks about, everyone in Brussels says, this is a crisis, we have to take advantage of it. So let's put all this investment into new industries and not restore old industries, while at the same time, as you know, the airlines are looking for aid, and people are worried about unemployment, and people are worried about huge piles of debt that are being built up. So what I did want to just raise, if people can be kind of brief, but do you think this ambition, this Brussels ambition to create this extra green development with new money, is this likely to happen? Or do you think it's going to get bogged down as usual in national decisions about national priorities? Stefan, do you want to respond to that? If not, fine, sure. Please.
Yeah. No, I think obviously there's this commitment that 30% of the money should be spent on climate change and on environmental protection. But I think you've pointed to the real dilemma, basically. We have a huge crisis, which in a way is good for climate change because you realize how things can change during a crisis. No European citizen had expected that the world, the life of every citizen can change so fundamentally within a few weeks, basically. So this, in a way, makes probably people capable of envisaging rather far-reaching change, also driven by climate change. So as such, I think it's a positive impetus. But as you said, the problem is the dilemma between the existing jobs and potential new jobs. Is it likely that a whole lot of this money will be invested in legacy industries that are basically obsolete, maybe to protect existing very much entrenched interests, or whether it will really go into innovation. And on that, I think this ultimately will be a national decision. It will depend very much on on the political systems in each country to determine the kind of share of resources that are devoted to. But the acute economic crisis with lots of job losses is not ideal for a very innovative, creative kind of restructuring of the economy. But the positive thing I want to say it once again is the fact that everybody realizes how life can change quite fundamentally. I think the preparedness of envisaging rather significant changes of lifestyle is probably higher now than it was a few months ago.
Great. Does anyone else want to respond to that? You'll have to wait.
Yeah, just
Michal,
briefly,
I can see you.
just briefly on that.
Okay, Heather, then Michal. No,
Sorry,
go ahead. Heather,
the
go
scale
ahead.
and the scale and scope of potential changes there, and also the willingness of citizens to follow government lead was much bigger. It's much harder for politicians to say, oh, the public will never accept this. No way can such radical changes be made. Clearly they can be made. And also the fiscal room is much greater. Now there's very little talk about austerity and about, oh, we can't borrow too much on the markets and we've got to keep debt levels down. That's just been blown out of the window. But the tricky thing is moving to what will be a very labor-intensive climate transition faster. Because as Stefan says, the key thing is employment. If you can show that climate transition will involve a lot of employment, which it will. Think about all of the putting insulation into homes and refitting buildings and building new infrastructure for electric cars. All of this involves a huge amount of labor. That's the thing that needs to be emphasized now at EU level. Great.
Michal, we've got about 5 minutes left. So believe it or not, time is passing. So off you go, but let's try to keep it brief. Go ahead.
Yeah, on the Green Deal and the climate ambitions, I would agree with Stefan and in saying that it's definitely going to be up to the member states. And there's one big problem with the way that the deal was struck in July between EU leaders. And what you could see is that in order to maintain the level of spending in the next generation EU, they basically slashed money from the budget and from other programs, which would be pan-European and which would be devoted precisely to the green transition. There's a sort of a national logic to it, that member states want a larger pot of money, which is more flexible, which they can use whichever way they see fit. So, for instance, rather than EU programs such as the Just Transition Fund, which would be distributed by the Commission, that obviously was slashed, so that governments can spend the next generation EU money as they see fit. And there's, I think, the problem. Some member states, some governments which are very committed to the climate targets will obviously spend them on the transition, whereas I fear that, for instance, my government will want as much flexibility in the money and in the grants so they can spend, building highways. This is, I think, the risk now, is that it's much more in the hands of member states rather than inside of an overall sort of commission-led Green Deal.
Right. That's what Europe needs, is more highways. I do have one question which I would like to raise from the audience, from Andrzej Matyszek, who basically says it's hardly a homogeneous political space, and that also applies to the Visegrad Four. So how much is the East-West division real for all of you? And are these division lines really having an effect on how the EU is functioning now? I mean, let's start with Kinga, and then maybe one other person who wants to answer, and then I think we're probably out of time. Kinga, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I think if we can call it either East-West division, North-South, or rather fragmentation of the EU. I don't think that in this crisis the member states reached any agreements, but so East-West divide will still exist, I would say. But it's I saw very evolution of the Visegrad 4. Being a Polish citizen, sitting in Slovakia is really interesting to observe, because from Warsaw, we always thought that we are the big leader of the V4 and our voice matters, and we are the ones that should represent the V4 in Brussels, which is not the case when you look at the V4 from Slovakia. Slovakia has much more different and more deeper links with Czech Republic or Hungary. And what was interesting, especially during the pandemic, is that Slovakia, I don't know what Michał thinks about it, but to me, Slovakia has started to cooperate closely, and there were more meetings with Austria and Czech Republic. They called it Slavko format. So it seems like Slovakia will never abandon V4, but it's also looking to its other options, and I guess it's trying to alienate a little bit itself from the bad view or the bad image that V4 has obtained in Brussels, and is trying to be a constructive player in the European Union.
Michał, how do you see it?
No, definitely.
Or is this putting you on the spot?
No. I mean, I think my country should definitely be looking at other options. Obviously, Visegrad is useful to the extent that it is, but on the EU stage, I think Slovakia absolutely needs to look at different other partners, ones that share its values, so to speak, and its outlook on the future of the EU, which frankly at the moment Hungary or Poland do not. And I think association with the Visegrad group and with these two countries in particular is toxic, and it's a problem for Slovak EU policy. I mean, that I think is quite clear to everyone, and I think this government, and I hope that it's going to be going to be doing that. But to just one final sentence on the broader point, the question that you asked, I think there is an increasingly not an east-west divergence, but there's a fragmentation in the EU along values of democracy, rule of law, and fundamental rights, and that's been going on throughout the pandemic, and that will be going on. I think by now it's not just Hungary and Poland. There might be there are not too encouraging signs from other member states as well. But I think at some point this is going to be the big issue that the EU will stumble upon, and that creates fragmentation in the legal space of the EU. And in all sorts of policies, so law enforcement cooperation, because how can you trust the government whose prosecutors are politically pliable and not independent? It throws up all sorts of issues. I think this is going to be the big wedge and possibly cleavage in the EU.
Right. Well, you've touched on something that worries me very much, because sometimes I think that it's the value question and the rule of law question that, if anything, will undermine this wonderful idea of shared sovereignty. I wish we had more time. You've all been great. I want to thank each of you. And as we stare down into the earth down below us, you should know that the next panel will take us to Mars. It will be about the future of Mars exploration, a mission of perseverance and ingenuity. So we look forward to that. We thank you all very, very much, and God bless the European Union. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
GlobeSec Bratislava Forum is the platform to tackle disruption and discuss solutions for better tomorrows.
The basic theme of disruption is crucial because, to me, the issue is not whether it's climate change or whether it's the Chinese or the Russians.